Olive owned a sports car. I had a family. A home. My mom died an old lady who never did anything with the top down. One day with the top down is better than a lifetime in a box.
Welcome to Film Trace, where we trace the conception, production, release, and execution of various films, and we are looking this cycle of episodes at Risqué Romances, the evolution of that kind of romance film in which scandal seems to be one of the keys. I'm your host, Chris. Dan is out this week. Thank you so much to our guest, though, for filling in and being my kind of default co-host. It's Lillian. Hi, Lillian. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here.
So I asked you on because I heard you talk about another film that we actually ended up covering on this set of episodes called My Beautiful Laundrette. And we talked about that last week, Dan and I, with a friend of ours. And I'm just so excited to hear from your perspective because I think that film, at least stateside, has really kind of gone under noticed over the years. Yeah. And so if you could explain to people, obviously they can tell by the accent, but who are you and where do you kind of fit into the world of film analysis and criticism?
Yeah. Oh my goodness, what a big question.
Sorry.
No, that's all right. I'm Lillian Crawford. I'm a freelance writer. I write for various publications, including Little White Lies, Sight and Sound, Empire Magazine, BBC Culture, lots of British publications around film, talking about film and various other forms of culture. I also host a podcast, as you mentioned, about British films, and my main interest is in sort of representations of women and queer people within British cinema, which is something that I've dedicated a lot of time to, and did this episode with a great critic, Layla Latif, on My Beautiful Laundrette, which is a wonderful film. I mean, even in this country, it's not being celebrated
really?
as much as you'd sort of expect it to be. Yeah, exactly. I mean, considering that it's sort of Daniel Day-Lewis's big role, I suppose that's sort of given it a bit more reasons for people to kind of go back to it, maybe. But I love that film. I think it's really, really beautiful. So yeah, that's kind of what I do.
Great. Yes. Thank you so much for being here. We are going to start by, actually talking about two American films today. So this should be interesting since your main focus tends to be British cinema, but feel free to make connections away because I actually did see a lot of interesting corollaries, at least in the relationship piece between our main feature, which is the Wachowskis' Bound from 1996, and the way the kind of queer relationship is represented in My Beautiful Laundrette, which is arguably, kind of secondary to the main plot of the film.
Yeah, definitely.
Which, especially with, we will end up talking about this in a different episode of the show, but like Brokeback Mountain in the 2000s here in America for cinema, it kind of really opened up this wide net for films that could specifically focus on gay romance. But before that, in the 90s, 80s, and even earlier, you have largely queer romances really kind of being, not the main focus of the film's narrative.
Yeah.
What were some of your first impressions? I'm curious to start. This is my first watch for both of these films. I've been wanting to see them forever. Yeah. But do you have any background or how did you come into watching Bound for our discussion?
Yeah, well, Bound is one of my absolute favorite films. I'm a massive fan of the Wachowskis, always have been. I think they're probably the first film of theirs that I saw was The Matrix. I'm sure it is for most people. And I've just absolutely loved their films ever since, and have been a great champion of all of their films, even when people have sort of not been so hot on the films that they've made. Cloud Atlas and Jupiter Ascending in particular are ones that I think have been sort of unfairly maligned, and I sort of stand waving my flag for Jupiter Ascending that no one else seems to be following. So yeah, it's really wonderful to go back to Bound, because it's a film that I saw when I was sort of really interested in the Wachowskis and their cinema and this sort of groundbreaking technological aspects of their films, which are often talked about.
Yeah.
But in this case, it's a film where, I mean, there is part of that. I think there are definitely elements of the cinematography in this film that sort of foreshadow things like The Matrix, which they make not too long after they make this film. But I think in particular, its approach to a lesbian romance, which I don't think has really been done in the same way since or before.
Yeah.
It's quite unique in the genre of film and that representation, and also being made by two lesbian filmmakers with a sex expert sort of choreographing that as well. It's that's never been done elsewhere, so it's a really unique film, and one that I'm glad we're talking about, because it's one that maybe not everyone has seen, because, as I say, it sort of comes before The Matrix, so people might not always go back to it.
Right. And I think, like you said, kind of with My Beautiful Laundrette, kind of going under the radar, both stateside and in Britain, I feel like there's a similar kind of pushback almost, where it's like, unless you're a true cinephile or anything like that, it's like, oh, Bound, yeah, that's the lesbian movie they made before The Matrix.
Right.
And I mean, I was interested in seeing it just because, like you said, like, even when I don't like the Wachowskis movies, you know, there's still something to like in them.
Right.
And I was curious, but I think I had that stigma in my head going into it. But I pulled the plug. I dove in head first, bought the Olive Signature Blu-ray release because it just looked so wonderful and had tons of great bonus features. And I was like, wait, maybe is this like a secret art film? Like, what am I getting myself into? And I was really blown away. Like, I think that when you have a film that has a lot of like the kind of steeped in cinema aspects to it, that it does, you know, references to film noir and Hong Kong cinema and all that, you might kind of not expect something that's actually like artful and meaningful. It might feel like more of a B movie kind of thing, pulpy thing. But it was so interesting that I was expecting one thing and really got something completely different. And I'm curious, like, as you've kind of watched the Wachowskis over the years, where did you, like, I mean, how do we not come back to that, especially the fact that they are themselves queer and have this movie that was the beginning of their career, and yet it still kind of has this almost like not so stellar representation when you've got like the Matrix franchise, and that's like as mainstream as you get.
It's really interesting. I think that it's something that Lily Wachowski in particular has sort of talked about in relation to this film and their films in general, is that since both of the sisters transitioned later on in their film career, Lily Wachowski talks about how a lot of people have sort of gone back and looked at their films and seen them with a different perspective, one of these films being made by women and being made by queer women at that. And I think that she's really keen on people looking at these films, or at least excited by that prospect, because they believe that those elements are there. There's a book by Carl M. Keegan called I think it's called Lana and Lily Wachowski, which sort of looks at all of their films through that lens and applying queer theory and trans theory to their films. I remember reading that book when it came out a few years ago, and Keegan starts with Bound. It makes sense, I suppose. He goes through the films in chronological order, and he's really talking about, in this film in particular, about sort of the closetedness of it, the fact that the film starts in a closet, that it's called Bound, and it's sort of the idea of that the Wachowskis have talked about for many years, is that everyone is in some form of closet on their identity and their form of expression. So I think it's a film that appeals not just as a queer film, but also one more broadly than that. That being said, it's not a film that was sort of acknowledged as such when it came out in 1996. I think that's something that is very much better understood and resonates more now, or rather the people who are talking about films, people in criticism, are people who are able to talk about how this film resonates, rather than if you look at someone like Roger Ebert's review of this film, where it's sort of lesbians are in an erotic thriller to sort of titillate, I guess, is kind of the idea of that it's like, if the point of the erotic thriller is to, well, normally to turn on a male audience, then that's the gaze that's going on with this couple. But if we look at this now, I mean, particularly after someone like Celine Sciamma's talked a lot about the female gaze with Portrait of a Lady on Fire and other films that have come since then, and we look at this film, it's so different, the way that it's shot, the way that it's choreographed in those sex scenes, and the relationship between them. And as you said earlier, it's not foregrounded, it's not the main part of the narrative. It's just a normal sort of romantic thread amongst this sort of noirish plot. So I think that's a really interesting interplay.
Absolutely. And so let's get into that narrative a little bit, because even though you're right, you have this thread that is not only choreographed and filmed, but also like it does have this interplay with the plot. I'd be interested to read this book that you're mentioning, because like my mind was going a mile a minute looking at everything from and the Wachowskis are not shy about this. Right from the get-go, all the plumbing imagery, right? Like, and that's the other wonderful thing about this movie, is that it's just as much of a comedy as it is a thriller and all that. And so you have Gina Gershon playing Corky, a plumber working in an apartment next door to Jennifer Tilly's Violet, who is living with Joe Pantoliano's Cesar. And ultimately, this is the story of, Cesar is a mobster, and there's these $2 million that they're trying to recover, and he does. And so then as Corky and Violet fall in love with each other, they hatch this plan to steal it, get away with it, run off together. And even in how the script is structured is so interesting, because and Joe Pantoliano plays a big role in a lot of the Wachowskis' work. He still is managed, like, he probably has just as much screen time, if not more, than either of the main characters, and yet he's still relegated to that kind of not only supporting role, but just like this, like there's no wiggle room for like us ever wanting to root for Caesar, and yet like it's Joe Pantoliano, so like he's magnetic and you want to keep watching him. But our sympathies are always very much aligned with the two women that are wanting to screw him over. I'm curious I assume you've seen this movie multiple times now, right?
Yeah.
Because I mean, of course, I just watched it last night, and I'm already wanting to watch it again. But through subsequent rewatches, have you noticed any kind of does it play any different, especially over the years, with how we kind of the viewer has their allegiances so uniquely wound up in Corky and Violet, even though Cesar is right there with us along the way just as much of the time?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there is a certain, I don't know if it's sympathy or pity on Caesar that you kind of feel that he's in this kind of uncut gems situation, really. That got himself in this absolute mess with like the mafia and the mob, and I think that there is you do end up starting to feel a bit sorry for him. It's like, oh my god, this guy can't catch a break. He's also not a nice guy, so we should stress, of course, that that only goes so far. But I think he's not your sort of typical tough guy. He's he's the same sort of character that Pantoliano plays in like The Matrix. Is like, he's a bad guy, but you kind of see where he's coming from, and you kind of feel like, okay, I can see why you might want out of this, and you'd take any opportunity you can to do that. That being said, I mean, the two female leads, Violet and Corky, are just so magnetic and so fascinating. I mean, the Jennifer Tilly and the way that she sort of has this hold over everyone, but the way she shifts her voice between how she talks to Corky and the way she talks to men, where she sort of makes herself almost vulnerable to them and makes it. Everyone in this film has their eyes on her, and she's totally in command of that. And I find that absolutely like fascinating and riveting to watch, because the audience is part of that, right? You're like completely in the palm of her hand. And Gina Gershon's amazing as well, but it's not so multifaceted as a performance. I think the way that she navigates those different relationships and the ways that she talks to different people is really fun to watch.
Right. And infamously, that was one of, the sticking points for the Wachowskis, is that Corky could not be a male character. They didn't even get to have a conversation financially with anybody until Dino De Laurentiis, who ended up producing it. And even he was trying to push for them to change that role. And they say straight up, like, they have no interest in that. And that the thing that really stuck with me, and Gina Gershon speaks about this a little bit in her interview at Ebert Fest in 2019, where it's like, yes, she is very much a female character, but when she's looking at like influences or inspiration for how to play that character, which you justifiably note is not necessarily as multifaceted as Violet and Jennifer Tilly's role, especially with how she speaks to different characters, and largely Corky's only interacting with Violet, but she plays it, and she says this in the interview, like she's thinking about Marlon Brando, James Dean, like these classic 50s really like stoic male characters that have this darkness to them, that have this kind of mysterious quality to them. But for the most part, like even through to the end of the film, which, spoiler alert, you should go watch Bound before you keep listening. But it's that classic, really just like somehow super effective, even though it's totally part of the trope of them like riding off to the sunset together.
Right.
And still Corky, even though, listening through the walls of countless men being murdered, is still got this like cool reserve to her and knows that like they pulled it off. So how do we unpack that? The fact that even though there's a strong focus on this female romance, and yet there's this, there is this strong pull, like she's literally a plumber. There's so much masculinity to her character,
right,
versus Violet's.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most fascinating things I think about the casting of this, I mean, it was a nightmare to cast, I suppose, in 96. Right. I think it would probably be cast differently now. It was the Jennifer Tilly was supposed to play Corky, which I just can't imagine. I don't know how she would have pulled that part. I mean, she clearly didn't think that she would do, because it was supposed to be Linda Hamilton playing Violet, which is also fascinating, because I can totally see like Sarah Connor in Terminator 2 being like the Corky character, in the way her sort of that character's kind of vibe and aesthetic, and it is, as you say, it is quite masculine. There is a certain butchness to that character. So I think that Gina Gershon is definitely the right person to play Corky, which is interesting, because I suppose but there's still no sort of defined roles between the two characters. What's like that sort of classic thing of interrogating all homosexual relationships stereotypically, that people will say like, which one of you is the man and which one of you is the woman, even though you're both of the same gender. And that it's not like one of them is sort of dominant and one of them is submissive. There is a sort of switching going on in the dynamic between the two characters that I think is really interesting, and is what, like, I mean, the final line of the film is just so great. When she says, well, do you know what the difference is between you and me?
Yeah.
She's like, no. She says, me neither. And then they drive off into the sunset, as you say. Is that there is this similarity, but it switches and it changes. It's not set in its roles, and I think that's a perspective on queer relationships that you just don't see very often. That it normally isn't. There isn't that same equity that you get
Right.
in this film, even though there is a power play. I mean, there is certainly a sort of hierarchy between the two of them socially, but that's broken down through the relationship that they have, and I think that's a really beautiful thread that sort of shifts rather than moves in one direction. I mean, that's what the Wachowskis are all about throughout their films, is sort of fluidity and not putting things into binary categorizations, that everything is sort of shifting constantly throughout their films. And that's been a source of criticism, I think. I think that's partly why some of their films have been not as embraced as other films, because it's not something that mainstream cinema audiences necessarily are used to or like. It's a different aesthetic that's going on. It's a different form of narrative that I don't think there are many other filmmakers creating. I mean, Carl Keegan in his book would say that that's a specifically trans thing, but I think it goes beyond that. I think it's just a way of seeing that is different to, which I think is benefited from the fact that there are two of them, that it's not just a singular perspective, that Lana and Lily Wachowski are able to sort of play off each other and interact and throw these ideas around, and you end up getting something that's sort of more balanced between the two of them rather than a singular narrow vision.
Yeah. And I mean, speaking of the Wachowskis' kind of vision here, I mentioned earlier the hard-boiled noir aspect, and you've got, like you kind of mentioned with the cinematography in particular, this kind of Hong Kong action thing that will follow them all the way through the Matrix franchise. But the other really strong influence, perhaps even more so than the Matrix, maybe this is your helps perhaps with your Jupiter Ascending defense, is the really strong graphic novel vibe and presence that's in this film. And I know that comic books have also been, historically one of the few places that queer authors and artists really had a place to really express themselves, and to really see that come through here, especially with that, not only the masculine aspects of Corky's character, but just like, being a mafia movie, right? That's typically a very masculine genre, and yet they're still able to bring this kind of almost like cartoonish softness to it that really helps. I don't know, for me, like I get so bored so easily by the ultra violence and the graphic action, and yet because they're so, I don't know, there's something like so fantastical about it. Like this it's just an ordinary 90s apartment, and yet it feels kind of otherworldly because of everything from the set design to how the characters are portrayed. And where is it, like, how, I mean, that it still amazes me, especially for a feature debut film. How are they able to take a movie that is essentially like phone calls and conversations and a briefcase full of money, and turn it into something so like bombastic and like visual? I don't know. Did you think about that at all as you were either watching or rewatching over the years?
Yes. I mean, especially when you're sort of watching it again in the context of their later films. I mean, you don't get more epic than a film like Cloud Atlas. It's just something played out on such massive scales that they did. I mean, even in The Matrix itself is sort of it is vast, and everything they've done since then has just been on the biggest possible scale. They have, I mean, Sense8, for example, their TV series is literally global. It's across multiple continents. So I just think that to go back and every time to think that they started by making this chamber piece, this sort of play, I guess, that's really, well, closet drama also, I suppose, is another way of describing it, is so fascinating because it's still got that same storytelling and sort of focus that those later films have. But maybe that's why it's still my favorite of their films. Maybe it's because they don't necessarily need that grandeur to it, that they can do that within a very small space. And actually, I suppose Lily Wachowski's kind of gone back that way now. She's sort of doing TV series and smaller scale work, while Lana Wachowski's just done the fourth Matrix film on her own, and she's still doing different projects with people like David Mitchell, developing bigger ideas and losing lots of money in the process, I suppose. Whereas this is a much safer way of sort of appealing and making sure that the film is successful. I don't know. It's really fascinating. You talking about like graphic novels and the sort of the appeal of queerness there, and specifically a female perspective as well. I mean, I think of particularly Susie Bright, who did the sex scenes within the film, and the way those are shot, and the way that they're. I mean, the main sex scene in the center of this film, I think, is quite inspired by Tony Scott's The Hunger. That's something I've reflected on quite a lot, is the way that the two sort of pivotal main sex scenes within those two films are different to each other. Is that this one is clearly coordinated by someone who has herself had sex with other women, and she described the film as being wet as opposed to hard, as a sort of feminine versus masculine. I think that's a really fascinating way of looking at the film as a whole, and it ties into what I was saying earlier about fluidity and the way that fluidity works in the Wachowskis' films. Is that there is a softness to this film, but it's one that is explicitly erotic. That it doesn't have to be masculine hard in order to be erotic. That it can also that there is a feminine sexuality to that, which to me as a woman is far more appealing as a mode of filmmaking, I think.
Definitely. What is so? I was curious about this because Susie Bright not only ends up being the technical consultant on the film for the reasons you just mentioned, she's got a cameo in the scene where they go to the lesbian bar, and it just seems like even before the Wachowskis transitions, you have this really strong sense of like wanting to do things right, and not just in technical sense, but also just like in a cultural sense. Like they want, they completely entrusted Bright to cast the extras in that lesbian bar to ensure that it had this sense of realism to it, which is almost ironic considering how pulpy and comic-y and unreal so many other aspects of the film are. Like they are tuned into, even back in '96, the importance of representation on screen. And that kind of rings true going back to My Beautiful Laundrette real quick, where it's like you see this importance of making sure the immigrant lifestyle is accurately portrayed, the classism, and yet these movies, even though they're doing this very huge thing, was it just like the world is not ready for like having that kind of conversation and giving that kind of respect where respect is due at this time?
Maybe. Yeah, I think that's probably it. I mean, if we think about intimacy coordination as a role in film, it's not something that I'd even really heard of until the last few years, and started noticing intimacy coordinators being credited at the end of films and investigating that. And I went to a panel a little while ago with some intimacy coordinators talking about the increase in demand for intimacy coordination in TV and film when there are scenes of a sexual nature of any kind. And that's not just in film, of course, and television. That's also in plays and operas and musicals and whatever. Anything that sort of requires intimacy needs to be coordinated in such a way that the consent is very much at the core of it, and the way that it's shown. I mean, I went to a Q&A with Claire Denis recently about her new film, Both Sides of the Blade, and she said that she doesn't believe in intimacy coordination. Like, I mean, it was very much the sort of thing that I'd probably expect Claire Denis to say. But to think that in 1996, the Wachowskis are absolutely convinced that if they're going to do this, they need. I mean, they originally didn't write it with the scenes in them, and it was Susie Bright who sort of told them that it would really help to flesh it out and to make it to give it that authenticity, and they listened and they worked with that. If a lot of the reviews around the time when this film was made are saying, well, this is a film that is impossible to believe was made by a man. Well, it's obviously not. It's made by two lesbian women,
Yes.
and it feels that way because I don't believe that unless the people writing it and creating it were themselves so aware of that, then it wouldn't have been the film that it was. But I guess contextually, I mean, I'm not even sure if that would have been possible. If that was known in the late 90s around who was actually making this film, whether or not it would have been made in the same way and produced in the same way, I don't know. I don't think there's a simple answer to that, but I certainly think that it's very important when we're looking at the history of film and the importance of the Wachowskis and what the Wachowskis are doing. I mean, as female filmmakers, they're doing stuff that no one else has done before throughout their career. And I think that that's something that needs to be acknowledged and celebrated more than perhaps it is. I mean, Bound is still a film that is fairly hard to get hold of. It's not one that people seem to have seen when you talk about the Wachowskis. As you say, there are Blu-rays now. There's been some fairly recently, and I think I have a DVD copy somewhere. But before that, it wasn't a film I was really aware of, because when you talk about the Wachowskis, again, it's all Matrix. Matrix is sort of very much writ large in their career,
Right.
and there's so much else to their filmmaking that is so rich and so interesting beyond just, oh, they invented bullet time.
Right, exactly. Would you actually see a little bit of
You see in this film?
Yeah. It's obviously subtler, but it's there for sure.
Absolutely.
And am I right in thinking that like this kind of more modern proliferation of intimacy coordination on film sets almost feels like another one of those like ripple effects of the Me Too movement, and directly in response to a lot of the still very aggressively majority male, cis straight male directing and producing that dominates Hollywood, right?
Yeah. Oh, for sure. I mean, it's definitely something that's been talked about a lot more since people started to talk about these things, particularly in relation to the film industry, and then not just the film industry, but as I said earlier, like other creative arts where people are engaging in these acts. Is that I think you're right that it's sort of percolated into all aspects of production, and I think that can only be a positive thing. So again, if we're talking about Me Too as being sort of a relatively contemporary phenomenon, then we're going back quite a way. This is a film that is doing things and pioneering techniques and ideas that are very much ahead of their time, in a way that we've always talked about the Wachowskis as being, but in a very different way. In terms of fight choreography, cinematography, etc., the sort of technical aspects that really sort of they've been pushed into, I suppose. When really there's something else that they were doing even before the Matrix, but throughout their films, which is shaping and shifting the conversation and the way that films are made. They can't just do that on their own, though. So I suppose it sort of stands out when you look at other 90s erotic thrillers. I mean, we're going to talk about one shortly, which does this in a completely different way. And like The Hunger, again, the way that the scenes between Susan Sarandon and Catherine Deneuve were shot was like, the idea of a closed set wasn't really understood, and like you think that it's going to be a closed set, but actually there's more people. I mean, even on this film, it wasn't actually a closed set because they had to move the actual sort of scenery around in order to shoot the sex scenes. But it's so fascinating when you hear the actors involved in these scenes talking about them, particularly when it's same-sex scenes. That there's a nervousness to it, and a lot of the time these films are shot with the actors have gotten drunk beforehand. It's like, well, that suggests to me a lack of comfort with what they're doing. I don't know. Maybe that's not the case, and I certainly don't think that's the case with this film. But I think it is the case with other films where you hear actors talking about sex scenes, and there's such a great discomfort around it, and the way that it's been, the dynamic that's gone on. I mean, I think, for example, of Julie Ormond in Baby of Masson, the Peter Greenaway film, and she talks later on about how Peter Greenaway would sort of stand and chew wine gums while they were filming this incredibly explicit sexual assault scene, and he was just sort of and all you could hear was him sort of munching in the corner watching.
God.
I mean, it's. I interviewed Peter Greenaway the other day. I didn't mention that. I didn't know if he'd particularly like to talk about that aspect, but it's a story that I think of. I mean, to take it to its most extreme example is something like Fernando Bertolucci's Last Tango in Paris, which there was very much not a consensual situation, and I think since then we sort of look back on those films and we hear the conversations around them in relation to Me Too, where it's not just about what's going on behind the scenes, behind the camera, but also what's actually going on in front of us on camera, and the levels of consent that are involved within that I think that Bound is doing in a time before the conversations that we've been having a lot over the last few years within film around the nature of consent.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that consent piece applies to so many other aspects too, not just on-screen sex scenes too, right? There's actually an interesting featurette with Chris Meloni, who plays the character of Johnny in the film, where he speaks of the torture scene in the bathroom.
Right.
And, you know, even in those instances where it's supposed to be gruesome, it's supposed to be button pushing or whatever, like the Wachowskis were very intentional about the level of, you know, comfort and discomfort that an actor should or, you know, should not have to be experiencing to replicate, to depict that kind of intensity. You know, he even goes so far as to say, like, you know, we wanted to get a rubber toilet so that when they, you know, plunge his face in there, they don't even have to worry about him nicking his head,
right,
or anything like that on the porcelain. They're unable to, so it's like they make sure that the actors on both sides are continuously able to, you know, take breaks and voice their concern when, you know, something's getting a little bit, you know, too close for comfort and all that. And I think that that's another aspect of it that plays through their filmography too, where it's like, even in the most visceral of scenes, you still have this kind of sense of warmth to their work. And I think that's perhaps one of the reasons why their work with on-screen violence and action has become so celebrated, and unfortunately it has not necessarily become the norm, but has become kind of the gold standard, where it's like they're able to do like even extended gunplay scenes and it never feels really exploitative. It feels fantastical, but it never feels like they're doing anything. There's just like and this is, I think, also one of the main defenses for Speed Racer, a Wachowski film that I don't necessarily like, but definitely admire and appreciate the fact that they're able to imbue this sense of we're just real, like there's just like it's good heartedness. Like I can't make fun of it, even though it's not something I particularly enjoy, because they're just so good at what they do.
Yeah. Speed Race is a magnificent film, I should stress.
Fair enough. I can definitely respect it. Maybe we should use that as a segue for us to talk a little bit about Poison Ivy, because you mentioned the Peter Greenway thing, and it definitely made me think of the fact that like on that set of Poison Ivy, the infamous 1992 thriller with Drew Barrymore playing the Lolita type, and then Tom Skerritt as the friend's father that she becomes romantically involved with, and there's like copious amounts of behind the scenes tidbits about how just like Tom Skerritt felt absolutely uncomfortable in every single scene they filmed together. And I'm curious from your perspective. Once again, this is my first time seeing it. I'd heard about it forever. It was like one of those movies where it was like I knew it was on like the Showtime free trial when in the 90s when I was growing up in the middle of the night, but it was like it was so taboo. And I did not have the same kind of like, wow, I love this movie kind of reaction. But I still think it's a disturbingly fascinating look at you use the phrase erotic thriller, which is what so much of the late 80s, early 90s was about. What's your kind of background and history with Poison Ivy, if anything?
Yeah, it's not one that I'd seen. It's one I was aware of.
Okay.
It's one that I sort of had interest in, mainly because I'm interested in sort of, even if it's not necessarily the most sort of groundbreaking queer film ever made, there is an element of queerness to it, I suppose.
Yes.
And I was aware of Sarah Gilbert and Drew Barrymore's performances. I mean, Barrymore is particularly exceptional, I would say, within this film. She's really, if Jennifer Tilly is in command of Bound, Drew Barrymore is in command of Poison Ivy.
Sure.
As you say, Tom Skerritt's very much sort of deeply uncomfortable throughout this film. It's not him who's sort of driving the eroticism at the heart of the film between him and Drew Barrymore's character, but it's one that she's very much in control and command of, and I think as a performance study of that kind of relationship, it's really interesting. It's extraordinarily problematic, of course it is. As you said, it's sort of Lolita. I mean, sometimes even sort of explicit references to Lolita when she's sort of sat out in the garden with in this sort of outfit that's very much like the Kubrick Lolita filming, with sort of Humbert watching Lolita in the garden. I think that, so it's knowing what it's actually saying about that is unclear to me. I think it's quite fetishistic at times. I mean, there is a scene in The Rain when she's wearing that outfit and it's completely soaked through, and she's having sex with Skerritt on his car. And I was thinking, yeah, I can see who this is trying to appeal to, which is the complete opposite of what we were talking about with the eroticism in Bound, which is very much sort of. I mean, I don't doubt that a male gaze could get something out of the female gaze of that film, but I don't think that that's who it's necessarily appealing to.
Right.
Whereas in Poison Ivy, it's pretty darn clear who those themes are intended for.
Right. And it's interesting because I wasn't even entertaining the thought of including this film in our series for these episodes until I, read a little bit up on it, and it has a woman director, which is unusual for a 1992 erotic thriller that is so male gazy.
Exactly.
But I mean, it kind of it's almost like another side of this conversation of who the power dynamic in Hollywood. Kat Shea was the director, and at the time, she largely was known as a hired hand for Roger Corman,
right?
B-movie exploitation film, mogul, and she directed a number of his films. Including Strip to Kill, The Patriot, and even the third Psycho sequel.
Yeah.
And so when she comes onto set for, kind of her first chance at like breaking through, like, and the other aspect of this is, even though Bound wasn't really an art film, but you look back on it, it feels like an art film. You go back and watch Poison Ivy, it doesn't look or feel like an art film, and yet it was a movie that premiered at Sundance and was very much seen as like this small independent film, but with a very clear kind of overhanging production centric feel to it, where it's like the execs literally said, make us a teenage Fatal Attraction. And that's essentially exactly what you get. There are those interesting elements, like you mentioned. I think the push and pull of the relationship between Ivy, if that is her real name, and Sarah Gilbert's character it does help make it a little more watchable than the average, teen girl seducing a older male figure. And also, like you mentioned, just Drew Barrymore's performance, like she is committing so much to this role that she somehow makes it watchable, and yet there's like this still very like kind of just trashy and assembly line feel to the film. And it's so bizarre to me how those two can kind of like coexist. How did they get just enough interesting things in there to make it passable from an artistic point of view, and yet it still is just like it just, I mean, I don't know where I don't know where to start. Take it away, Lillian.
No, it's interesting what you're saying, because Kat Shea is sort of, I almost wonder if I suppose her relationship to Roger Corman as a director is really interesting, because I suppose if this feels like it could be a film that someone like Corman would make. I mean, in the sense of that gazing, and it's like female directors in this period who are sort of, many of them are having to sort of emulate what men are doing, and the male way of making films. And those films that you mentioned, things like Strip to Kill, The Rage, Carrie 2, and so on. These are films which are sort of just, it's like doing a pickup job almost. Like you have to sort of take it, and it's like whenever it's one of those films where you say to someone, "Oh, that was directed by a woman." They go, "Was it?" Like something like American Psycho, which I suppose is probably the most famous one when Mary Sheridan's directed it. I mean, that's a really fascinating film to talk about in a different way in terms of the way that films like The Matrix, I guess, have been sort of appropriated by a certain sort of male audience, by contrast to how a female audience might actually engage with it. I don't know if I can get that from Poison Ivy. I don't know if I can sort of watch this film and see and see if there's an aspect of something. I mean, maybe there is something within the queerness of Sarah Gilbert's character, and the way that she sort of develops this sort of connection to and love for Ivy as the lead character. I mean, the film opens with her sort of addressing directly the fact like, is she a lesbian? Which I thought was which is dismissed very quickly. It's like, I thought I might be a lesbian. I'm definitely not. It's like,
Right.
okay, sure.
And then she goes on to obsess over.
Well, exactly. But like, even then, like, the kiss between the two of them is a big deal. This is like a period in film when a same-sex kiss is still sort of like a big thing, and it's a big thing for these two actors. And there's this hilarious sort of interview with Sarah Gilbert where she's sort of saying that they were nervous about it, so they decided that they should get some practice in the van before they went on to set.
Right.
It's like, yeah, sure. Yeah, I don't know if that, maybe that makes it slightly more interesting than some other erotic thrillers from the early 90s in some ways. And I think that I was watching this film hoping for some kind of reappraisal or some kind of reclamation of it, which I didn't really get. It wasn't like, oh wow, there's this long lost lesbian film that I hadn't seen yet. It was like, okay, no, this is just doing that thing that a lot of erotic thrillers do,
right.
where it's sort of that's enough to sort of fetishize, I guess, but as long as we make sure that there's also plenty of sort of heterosexual sex going on as well within the narrative.
And yet, it's there's this long line of direct-to-video sequels from it, and it has just that phrase has become kind of appropriated as like synonymous with that kind of thin line between pornography and a trashy erotic thriller from the 90s. And you have this almost like it makes it unfortunate because and it's not just the Poison Ivy franchise. There's The Crush, The Babysitter, like all those 90s films that do this essentially very similar kind of premise. And yet, at least to my knowledge, I haven't seen in full any of those films, much less in several years when they were playing on TBS and stuff, edited, I'm sure, for general audiences. But when you have still like that, like there's so that still seems to it seems to be one of those cases of just like it had the potential to actually do and be something different, and it would just had fallen by the wayside. Like there was still the original ending planned was for Ivy to survive and hitchhike on her own out of town, but the New Line Cinema execs said no, you got to change it. And it's just like, I mean, being a Roger Corman mentee, it's clear that like she's got a sense of like, this is the industry, I'm going to work within the system, I'm going to do what my bosses tell me, kind of vibe to it. It doesn't have that kind of more intrepid visionary. And I'd hope the Wachowskis would agree with this, where it's like they at the time probably still had a good amount of privilege to like be able to do that with their first feature film. And yet here it's like now Kat Shea is, not only did she go on in the 90s to make The Rage Carrie 2, but then she basically was relegated to TV movies for the rest of her career.
Still is. I mean, her latest film is a Netflix film about a dog.
Yeah. So it's really unfortunate because you're right. There could that queer element, if there was more of a focus on that relationship, and if the third act wasn't such a complete predictable mess. I mean, there's also the mother character that we haven't even mentioned yet. That, speaking of problematic,
oh my God, yeah,
it's like treating mental illness the way you'd expect like a 1950s movie too.
Yeah.
What really just like was the nail in the coffin for me, because I also was like watching the film waiting for like, and I was really hopeful by the beginning of the film, and this kind of, once again, almost noirish voiceover happening, and this kind of curious, unreliable narrator perspective. It really gave me vibes of like Nick Carraway, the Great Gatsby, where it's like you've got this person that doesn't want to admit that they have this queer obsession with this other, and yet it just fall like all the pieces fall right in line with what you'd expect, as if the Wachowskis were convinced to make Corky a male character, in which case Bound would have been a footnote in history, like Poison Ivy is now.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No.
So, with that, I'm curious at the end of this, Lillian, if you would like to make any final plea to the listeners, myself included. Because I think I would agree Bound is my favorite Wachowskis film. And I am tempted to go back and give both Speed Racer and Jupiter Ascending another shot. I don't know if I can give Cloud Atlas another one, but I'm willing to hear your final thoughts.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I mean, Poison Ivy's fun. Watch that. I mean, I want to watch Poison Ivy 2. That looks like a romp. Also directed by Anne Gorsand and written by Chloe King. So that one intrigues me. So maybe that's what I'll be doing. But yeah, no, I think. Please watch Bound. It's so good, and it is more accessible to get hold of than perhaps it used to be. And yeah, do go and watch Jupiter Ascending and Speed Racer and Cloud Atlas, for goodness sake. My goodness. Read the book first, then watch Cloud Atlas.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe that helps. Maybe it's because I'm such a massive fan of the book that it appeals so much. But yeah, no. Definitely watch these.
Thank you so much, Lillian, for joining us. If people want to read up more on your stuff, obviously they can just Google Lillian Crawford film. But is there anything that you're currently working on or that people can expect from you in the near future?
Yeah.
And also plug your pod one more time, please.
Oh, thank you. Well, I co-host a podcast called Autism Free Cinema, where I we talk about films that sort of resonate with autistic people, including myself, and the nature of autism and film, which is really that can be found on all podcast places. My other one is called Listen to Lillian. I have a website, lilcroft.co.uk. That's Lil with 2 L's in the middle. And that's also my Twitter handle, if Twitter still exists by the time that this goes out. Yeah, so these are places where you can find my work. I suppose actually, if Twitter's not going to be there, then across the internet on Sight and Sound, Empire, Little White Lies, BBC Culture, various places, as you say. Google me, and film reviews and thoughts will come out in abundance.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lillian, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. This has been Film Choice.